Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to look at one of the oldest and most fascinating traditions in the world, Egyptian mythology. For thousands of years, the people of the Nile told stories about how the world was created, about gods who controlled the sun, the sky, and the afterlife, and about kings who were seen as living gods on earth. These myths explained the rhythm of life and death, the flooding of the river, and the journey of the soul after it left the body. They weren't just stories, they were at the heart of how the Egyptians understood their world. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're winding down, trying to drift off, or just curious about the past, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. Before the first king took a throne, the Nile taught the people the shape of eternity. Each year, the river rose with the breath of the southern rains, spilled its brown water into the fields, and fell away again to reveal a skin of black earth, as soft as fresh clay. Villages clung to the fringe between floodplain and desert, reed huts facing waterways like watchers at a threshold. And in the eastern sky, the sun lifted clean from the horizon, as if from a hidden mound beneath the first light. In this landscape of water, silt, and long stone shadows, belief gathered weight. Hunters painted boats and antelopes, and men with raised arms on desert cliffs where the wind never slept, and potters of the Nakada cultures turned out red jars and cream jars with dark painted ships, crowned cattle, and birds that looked down like judges. Ivory tags from Abydos carried tiny incised signs, not yet a language, but already a promise that names could be trapped in matter. Knife handles, such as the one later found at Gebel El Arak, thronged with lions and river battles and long sleek boats, a crowded memory of power and motion. From Hierakonpolis, where the hawks ruled the air and the river bent like a great arm, came a palette showing the triumph of a ruler and the gaze of a falcon. Long before the first pyramid, the people had learned to read the river and the sky as script, and they answered with offerings set on mud altars and with quiet words before images cut into stone. Across centuries of predynastic time, the gods took on faces drawn from the creatures that owned the margins. The jackal that prowled the western escarpment kept company with the dead and would one day guide them. The cow, whose horns held a disk of sun, became a lady of sky and love. The falcon drifted above the riverbanks and learned to sit on the tops of palace facades. At Abydos, in the desert field later called El Kab, the great tombs of early rulers and nobles pushed into the sand like grounded boats, and within them lay jars, pallets, and the first labels with signs that could name a person and a place. In these graves, the living tried to bribe death with food and jars of beer and small carved servants, and the plain fact of survival after the flood season taught them that order was a thing that could be made and kept, not only prayed for. In the last predynastic generations, the symbols of kingship condensed as if the mist of myth had suddenly cooled into metal. The Serik, a little facade of a palace with a space for a royal name, rose up on jars and mace heads, and above it perched the falcon of Horus, a god of sharp sight and high judgment. Crowns announced domains. The white crown of the south stood tall like a lotus bulb. The red crown of the north curled forward above the brow like a serpent ready to strike. These were not decorations. They were geography turned into law. Then came the moment when war and ritual and story fused on a single slab of stone. The Narmer palette, lifted from the soil of Hierakonpolis, shows a king in the tall white crown seizing an enemy by the hair, his arm raised with the certainty of the old gods, while the falcon of Horus holds a papyrus marsh by a tether as if to claim the delta reed by reed. On the reverse, the same king wears the red crown and walks at the head of a procession. Two long-necked beasts are restrained in a knot that makes order from struggle, and a bull batters down a walled gate as if to declare that stone will answer to flesh when the gods consent. Nearby in time stands the scorpion Macehead, with a ruler who opens a canal as attendants bear standards and the plant signs of river and land keep careful count. These objects are not the whole history, but they are a door that has swung open to reveal a country discovering itself. Names of early kings appear as falcon names in Syrinx. Offerings multiply at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. The first large enclosures rise, and the earliest kings leave behind tombs stocked with jars and labels and sacrificed animals, grim tokens of an economy already bound to ritual. The landscape has become a theology. The flood confirms that there is a pattern. The sun confirms that there is a cycle. The palace facade with the falcon confirms that there is a man who will stand as the hinge between heaven and earth. By the time the white crown and the red crown are worn together, the two lands are already a prayer made flesh. The river has given Egypt a map for belief, and the first gods have given its kings a language of stone and symbol with which to speak back to the world. When the first priests stepped out onto the temple roofs at dawn and watched the red rim of the sun rise from the low haze, they were reliving a moment older than memory. At Heliopolis, the story began with a silent water that filled everything, a darkness too deep for breath, the limitless flood called Nun. From that stillness, a mound rose as if the earth itself were learning to stand, and upon that first hill the god Atum came into being by his own will. He brought forth Shu, who was the dry breath of air, and Tefnut, who was the sweet moisture that kisses the skin of morning. From them came Geb, the patient earth, and Nut, the long arc of the sky, lovers pried apart so that day and night could be born. Their children were Osiris and Isis, Seth and Nephthys, and with those four, the pattern for kingship and its trials was set. The priests called this company the Ennead of Heliopolis, and they pointed to a sacred stone in their sun court, the Benben, as a sign of the first mound. Each sunrise proved the tale, for the sun rose again from the waters and climbed the sky in a bark that none could see yet all believed. When the king fed the cult of Ra, the world kept turning, and when he failed, storms and low floods were feared to follow. Thus creation at Heliopolis was not only an old story. It was a daily engine, and at its heart stood the throne. Up the river at Hermopolis, a different beginning was spoken in the cool of libraries and the shade of colonnades. There, the sages named an Ogdoad, 8 primeval powers in male and female pairs. Nun and Norne were the waters without shore. He and Hauhet were the endless reach of time. Kuk and Kauket were the thick darkness before lights were kindled. Amun and Amone were the hidden breath and the unseen will that stirs the still pool. From their mingling rose an island that had never been, and upon it appeared a lotus that opened in the first light. From its cup a child shone forth, the newborn sun, crying with the voice of a hawk, and the world at last could see itself. In this city, the scribe god Thoth kept the ledger of what had come to pass, and the stars seemed to march at his word. Farther north at Memphis, another vision took hold. The craftsman of Pa said that the world was made in the mind and spoken into form. Pa conceived in the heart, which is the seat of thought, and he gave life with the tongue, which utters names. What was named became real. Gods were named, beings were named. Every town and field and creature learned the sound that fixed it in the order of things. This doctrine was preserved on a royal stone, later called the Shabaka stone, a black slab whose worn lines still whisper that thought and speech built the first day. In the workshops, the tapping of mallets and the hiss of the chisel answered that creed, and the statues that opened their eyes at the end of the rite seem to agree that the sung name has power. In these places, the people learned that creation could begin with a flood, or with an egg, or with a word, yet all roads led to the same rising sun and to the same need for balance. In Thebes, the priests spoke of Ammon, the hidden one, a god like a warm wind that none can see, yet all can feel, who rose and took the sun into himself as Ammon-Ra. The hymn said that he was older than gods and younger than the dawn, that he filled the lungs of kings and peasants alike, that he could not be painted yet was present in every painted shrine. This was not a quarrel with Heliopolis or Memphis. It was a deepening. What is seen is born from what is unseen, and what is unseen requires a rule to govern it. That rule the Egyptians called Ma'at. It was truth and right measure, and the proper weight of a word. It was the straight path in law courts and the exact balance of the scale that weighs a heart. It was the feather on the brow of a goddess and the cool order of a well-cut channel. The oldest holy texts we possess already speak its language. In the narrow chambers of the pyramids at Saqqara, the walls of Unas and of Teti carry the pyramid texts, lines of prayer and spell and praise that tell of a tomb on the first hill, of the great waters of Nun, of the sky goddess who lifts the dead king to the stars. The spells treat the king as a being who must be reborn among the imperishable lights and sail with Ra across the day. They speak in riddles and in thunder, yet behind the poetry stands a sober claim. Creation is an order that must be remembered and renewed. The crown does not float alone on the river. It is bound to the sun and to the law that holds the scales steady. Each temple that faced the east was a doorway through which the first morning entered again. Each name carved into stone gave a thing its place. In this way, the many beginnings were woven into a single cloth, and the cloth was called Egypt. The sun rose each morning like a golden scarab pushed from the mouth of the eastern horizon, and with it rose the business of keeping the world intact. At Heliopolis, the elders said that Ra had many faces in a single day. As a child, he was Khepri at dawn. As a lord, he was Ra at noon. And as an elder, he was Atum at sunset, who folded the light and lowered it into the western hills. Each night, he crossed the 12 caverns of the hidden realm in a bark surrounded by gods with knives and spears, while the serpent of unmaking tried to coil itself around the boat and swallow the hours. Each dawn proved that courage and order still held. The king and the priests were not spectators to this passage. They were accomplices. On the open courts of the sun temples at Abu Ghurab, the stone altars drank the noon blaze, and a pyramidion stood like the tip of the first hill, a reminder that the first morning was a thing that could be rebuilt with stone and rite. Obelisks at Heliopolis, and later at Thebes, were the petrified rays of the sun, sharpened to pierce the sky, so the light would answer when called. In the west at Saqqara, the causeways led from the river to the valley temples, and from there to the mortuary houses where kings waited to be fed forever by words and bread. Everywhere, the message was the same. The sun was a cycle, but a cycle could break. It was the duty of Egypt to see that it did not. The daily temple ritual moved with the same quiet certainty as the river. Before dawn, the pure priest bathed in the sacred lake and shaved his body and put on clean linen, so the god would not smell common life on his skin. He entered the sanctuary at first light and broke the clay seal of the shrine so the doors could open. He greeted the hidden statue with the presentation of Ma'at, a small goddess figure held in both hands, as if to say that truth and balance were the first gift of the day. He awakened the god with hymns, washed the image with cool water, anointed it with cedar and myrrh, and dressed it in fresh cloth and gold. He laid bread and beer and roasted fowl on trays, censed the room with sweet kefi, and traced protective signs to seal the offerings with life. He then withdrew and closed the doors so the god might dine in peace. The same rite repeated at noon and at dusk with a different color of light, and the world felt the benefit of it. The offering formula that tomb owners prized began with the king because the king was the man who paid for the service. The words carved on stone were a chain that linked estates and fields to kitchens and granaries, and those kitchens to incense burners and altars. When the priest said an offering given by the king to Ra, or to Osiris, or to Hathor, he declared that the throne still kept its side of the contract. The scripts have faded on many walls, but the logic remains clear. Food became magic in the presence of a name. Magic became law in the presence of a king. Over all this stood the figure who called himself Son of Ra. The royal titulary kept the sun at its core, and the crowns proclaimed the union of the two lands as if they were a single prayer made visible. The said festival was the trial and renewal of that bond. In the 30th year of a reign, and sometimes many times after, the king put on a short white robe and a tight cloak and came into a great court set, with chapels and thrones. The oldest example of such a court lies inside the complex of Djoser at Saqqara, where dummy shrines line a stone enclosure and doorways face one another like judges waiting to be satisfied. There the rite is written into the architecture. The king emerged before the people, took the white crown and then the red crown, and sat upon the paired thrones to show that both lands accepted his weight. He ran between markers to prove strength. He performed offerings to the gods of the gnomes, and he received the blessing of his father Ra to rule anew. Scarabs and reliefs from later centuries boast of jubilees held by mighty Amenhotep, who celebrated 3 said festivals as if to drink youth again, but the idea was already old when he took the throne. The festival said that time would not erode the bond between the sun and the throne, that Ma'at still lay under the sandals of the king, that the breath which once filled Atum at the first dawn still filled the chest of the ruler who kept the rites. The people watched and felt the year turn as if a new creation had come to pass on the very flagstones. The priests recorded the gifts that poured into the temples, and the scribes took note of cattle and barley and vineyards assigned so that the engines of worship would not stop for lack of grain. In this way, the myths of creation were not left to quiet rooms and learned men. They were hammered into stone and walked in procession. The king did not merely tell the story of Atum who rose from the mound. He stood on a raised platform at dawn while the sun struck the obelisk in front of him and the stone turned white with fire. He did not simply speak of Ma'at. He held Ma'at out to the god and then turned and judged cases in the courts of his cities and sent orders to clear canals and punish thieves and count the grain. The day was a liturgy with a sunrise at one end and a sunset at the other, and between those poles the machinery of rights and law moved. The gods sailed across the sky, and the king walked the earth, and between them, in the measured lane of the Nile, Egypt went about its work and trusted that the next morning would come. The state religion of Egypt did not live only in stories told at dusk or in hymns murmured at dawn. It breathed in timber hauled from quarries and barley counted in granaries. It moved in barges that slid along the canals with jars of beer and oil stacked like soldiers on parade. At Giza, the royal causeways ran like stone rivers from the floodplain up to the bright terraces of the mortuary temples, and from those terraces, the doors opened toward the pyramids, where kings slept with their names guarded by the falcon. The valley temples at the river's edge received the statues of kings in solemn procession and fixed them in cool halls of granite and alabaster. At Khafre's Valley Temple, the floors shine still with a polish that remembers the feet of priests who washed the image and dressed it in linen and gold while the Sphinx watched with a lion's patience. At Saqqara, the step pyramid complex of Djoser spread a city of ritual in carved stone, with courts for jubilees and chapels for ancient gods, and a hidden chamber where the king's car stared out through drilled eyes toward the north. Heliopolis raised obelisks that caught the sun like spears of light and set a benben at the center as a sign that the first mound still rose in the heart of the world. In these places, religion took on weight. Every block cut and every channel dredged was an act that anchored myth in earth. The Palermo stone and the annals that followed listed gifts to temples with the pride of kings who knew that to feed a god was to steady the sky. The priests who tended this machine were many and ranked like troops in a well-kept army. The high priest was the first servant of the god, at Heliopolis the great of seers, who read the Sunday. Under him served the lector priests who carried the library of sacred words, the Sem priests in panther skin who opened the mouth of statues and of mummies so breath might return, the pure priests who shaved and bathed and moved like white birds through dark sanctuaries, and the countless Ka priests who kept the fires and poured the beer before the false doors of the dead. They worked in rotating files, 4 houses of service that took their turn by month, so that the shrines never lacked a voice or a hand. Scribes measured grain and cattle owed to the gods. The Abusir papyri from the sun temples of the 5th dynasty show accounts that read like the pulse of a living creature. There are lists of bread loaves for daily offerings, deliveries of geese and beef for festival days, tallies of incense and wine, even rosters of boat crews that ferried goods between estates and the temple storehouses. The standard offering formula carved across the land began with the king because the king guaranteed the flow. An offering which the king gives to Osiris, lord of Abydos, an offering which the king gives to Anubis upon his mountain. 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of oxen, 1,000 of fowl. The words were not exaggeration, but expectation. Behind each 1,000 lay a field cleared of reeds and ploughed after the flood, a granary kept dry with careful mud plaster, a herd counted by a man with a reed pen tucked behind his ear. By the Middle Kingdom, the system had grown broader and more deliberate. The first intermediate period had shown what hunger of the gods looked like when central power faltered. Mortuary endowments lapsed, local strongmen claimed the tithes of sacred fields, and the voices in many chapels went thin. The reunification under Mentuhotep at Thebes brought the rites back with a conqueror's energy, and on the West Bank he built a mortuary temple that fused mountain and house of God, a sign that the state and the sacred had remarried. When the kings moved their court to Ichtawi in the Fayum Basin, they did not neglect the old sanctuaries. Senusret, the son of Amenemhat, founded and endowed the growing precinct of Amun at Karnak, set up the fine white court that bears his name, and bound Thebes to the fortunes of a god whose hidden nature suited an age that prized order and reach. In Abydos, he and his successors honored Osiris with new chapels and permitted a river of pilgrims to leave their stelae at the sacred wall. Royal decrees exempted temple lands from certain levies and confirmed their rights to fisheries, gardens, and vineyards, which made the houses of the gods some of the richest landlords in the kingdom. At the same time, the crown knew the cost of neglect. Senusret the Stern curtailed the pride of nomarchs and drew temple offices back into the circle of the palace. The priests received wealth and honor, but they were reminded that their breath came from the throne. Workshops attached to temples turned out faience amulets and linen for vestments, metal fittings for barks, cosmetics for anointing, and beer brewed to standard for the altars. On festival days, the processional barks left Karnak and moved along the river road to Luxor, while the people raised their hands and cried for blessing. And in that tide of voices, 1,000 private hopes reached the ears carved on stelae that promised that the god would listen. The cult economy fed bellies, and it fed meaning. A farmer who carried a sack of barley to the temple granary knew that some part of that grain would become breath for the statue at dawn and would become bread on his own table at dusk when the god's portion returned as a blessed remnant. In this way, the machinery of religion and the labor of the fields turned the same wheel. The shrines lit at sunrise with the face of an institution that gathered and spent with a steadiness that made Egypt feel immortal. Night gathered early in Egypt, for the western desert rose like a great wall and took the sun into its arms. The people watched the disk sink and knew that this was not an ending, but a passage. The river had taught them that life withdraws and returns. The fields browned and then broke into green. The old moon shrank and was born again from a thin white reed of light. In such a place, the dead could not be allowed to fall into silence. They must be guided, preserved, fed, and named, so that their voices would be heard in the halls beyond the horizon. The earliest graves near the Nile were cut into the dry earth, where the heat drank away the damp and saved the flesh by accident. That good accident became a doctrine. The soul was many-layered, a house of several rooms. The ka was the life breath that asked for bread and beer and could sit upon a chair and enjoy the scent of incense if the proper words were said. The ba was the quick and curious self that could fly like a bird with a human face, wander by day, and return by night to the body it loved. The ach was the shining one made effective by rites, the finished spirit that could join the imperishable stars and live among the companions of Ra. There were other parts as well, the ib, which was the heart and the seat of judgment, the ren, which was the true name that fixed a person in the world, and the shadow which followed like a second skin. If any one of these were lost or starved or unnamed, the whole person risked a second death, a failure of memory and of being. The Egyptians set themselves against that fate with a craft that was both tender and relentless. By the time the kings raised step pyramids at Saqqara and bright faces at Giza, the care of the dead had become the province of specialists who worked close to temples and cemeteries. They called their place the Pure House and the Beautiful House, where the scent of resin hung in the air and the floor was washed each morning with cool water. The priest of Anubis, wearing a jackal mask for the solemn moments, presided with a hand that knew each step by heart. The body was brought to a table of stone. The brain was removed through the nose so the skull would not split. The viscera were lifted from the belly and treated with resin, then set apart in 4 jars under the protection of the sons of Horus. The human-headed Imseti watched over the liver. The baboon-headed Hapi guarded the lungs. The jackal-headed Duamutef kept the stomach. The falcon-headed Kebesnufef kept the intestines. Each jar had its goddess at its side, Isis and Nephthys and Neith and Serkeh, who spread their hands over the contents and calmed them with words. The body was then bathed in palm wine and packed in dry natron, so that water fled and corruption failed. 70 days marked the work from first washing to final wrapping, a royal span of time that gave dignity to grief and allowed the family to gather the goods that would be needed for eternity. When the salt had done its labor, the skin was oiled, the cavities were filled with linen and resin, and amulets were set upon the limbs and chest to guard the gates of the night. The wrappings came next in long patient bands. The embalmers sang as they wound the cloth, and they tucked in the Wadjet eye for health, the Djed pillar for stability, and the knot of Isis for protection where the heart might notice it. At the end, the face received a mask of cartonnage or gold if the house was wealthy, so that the bar would always know the countenance it loved. What began as a lucky burial in hot sand had been refined into a theology in linen and cedar and words. Tombs grew from simple pits into houses that could outlast dynasties. In the age of the early kings, the mastaba rose as a bench of mud brick and stone, with a chapel for offerings, a shaft to the burial chamber, and a full store carved to look like a doorway that did not open. Through that door, the car was thought to pass to receive the bread and beer that the living set upon the table. The walls bore scenes of estates and workshops and hunting in the marshes, so that the dead would remember who they were and what they owned. At Saqqara, the first step pyramid of Djoser stacked mastabas into a stairway for a king, and around it stretched a city of ritual where jubilees were rehearsed in stone, so that even death would not break the cycle of royal renewal. At Giza, the causeways ran from river to burial-like arteries that kept the heart beating. In hidden chambers, the king faced north toward the undying stars, the circumpolar lights who never set, and he was expected to join them as an ark, a bright companion in the sky. The spells that promised this ascent were carved inside the stone itself. In the pyramid of Unas and those of Teti and Pepi after him, the walls bear the earliest sacred texts in the world that can still be read. These pyramid texts speak in the voice of a king who climbs the ladders of the sky, who sails with Ra by day and rests in the arms of Nut by night, who rejoices as Osiris and lives again as Horus. They are terse and startling, a language of stars and boats and bulls that was meant to work as well as to inspire. Words could be doors if they were cut into stone in the proper places and spoken by the proper mouths. The theology of preservation deepened as the craft matured. Statues of the deceased were placed in secret chambers called serdabs, their eyes peering through narrow slots so they could see offerings and feel the light. The ceremony called opening of the mouth gave the statue and the mummy the power to breathe and to speak and to eat, with adzes touching the lips and incense and milk, presented in turn so that senses would awaken. Families set up stelae in chapels with the offering formula that began with the king, because royal authority still underwrote the supply of divine kitchens, but the names on the stone were the names of carpenters and soldiers and women who kept households and were loved. They poured water for the car and spoke the name aloud so the wren would not fade. They wrote letters to the dead when trouble came, scolding or pleading as need demanded, and left the bowls in tomb courtyards with a few drops of beer as payment for attention. In all this, there was no panic. There was method. The work of the embalmers and the words of the priests and the gifts of the living formed a braid that could pull a person across the dark river. The Egyptians did not deny decay, they mastered it. They took it apart with knives and salt, and bound it again with linen and resin and speech. They trusted that a soul is a house that can be rebuilt if the plan is followed and the walls are named. When the mourners at last sealed the door, and the priest murmured that the West would welcome this new Osiris, the family turned back to the light of the river with a grief that was heavy but also ordered. They had done what the gods required. They had placed a human being into the story of the Sunday. By the age of the warrior kings, the afterlife became a garden mapped in ink and guarded by words that could open doors. Scribes laid long sheets of papyrus across a board, smoothed them with a damp hand, and copied in black and red the chapters of the Book of Going Forth by Day, which we call the Book of the Dead. In its spells, a traveler learns the names of gates and the passwords of keepers, the forms to assume and the waters to cross, so that the soul is not delayed by ignorance. The most solemn chapter is the confession in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The dead speaks 42 denials before 42 assessors with nomes and titles as old as the land. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied, I have not diminished offerings. The jackal god Anubis stands by the scale and adjusts the tongue of the beam with a paw as careful as a craftsman. The ibis-headed Thoth writes the verdict with his reed pen, and the monster called Amit waits crouched and still, part crocodile, part lion, part river horse, a final hunger that will devour a guilty heart and end a life forever. To guard against the weakness of flesh, a green stone scarab is set upon the chest and bound with a spell called Chapter 30b, which begs the heart not to stand up and accuse its owner in the hour of judgment. The papyri that preserve these scenes have names we still speak aloud. The papyrus of Ani with its great vignette of scales and a feather bright as snow. The papyrus of Hunefer, where the wife takes the hand of her husband as if to walk with him into the verdict. In each, the soul that passes the test is declared true of voice and welcomed to the field of reeds, where canals are straight as rule lines and barley grows taller than a man. Around the wrapped body rose an army of helpers. Shabti figures carved in faience or wood stood in their rows with hoes and baskets, ready to answer the call when work is demanded in the blessed fields. Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead gives them their marching order. O Shabti, if I am summoned or if there is work to be done in the realm of the dead, you shall say, Here I am. Wealthy burials could muster a full company, one for each day of the year, and overseers for the 10 days, a small nation of servants who would spare their master the weight of labor. The jars that held the organs kept their vigil as well. Each vessel bore the head of a son of Horus and the name of a protecting goddess, and each rested in a chest like a shrine within the tomb. In the burial of Tutankhamun, the viscera were sealed in little golden coffinets with the faces of the king, and were kept within a fine alabaster chest that drank the lamplight like milk. A heart amulet lay on the breast, a jade pillar guarded the spine, a knot of Isis warmed the blood, and the Ankh sign announced life as a promise repeated. All this was bound in linen and resin and prayers. The opening of the mouth rite gave breath and taste back to the dead, with adzes and incense and milk, so that the soul would know bread and beer again. The goods that lined the walls were not simple show. Beds with lion feet were for sleeping in the field of reeds. Boats with painted eyes were for sailing the canals of the blessed West. Jars of beer and wine ripened in the dark, as if the tomb were a cellar prepared for a long-awaited return. The kings chose a valley to the west of Thebes for their own passages, a dry ravine beneath a peak that holds the shape of a natural pyramid. There the tombs of the New Kingdom snake into the limestone, their corridors turning and dropping like a river cut into stone. In those painted halls, the afterlife was not left to chance. The walls bloom with the books of the night. The Amduat charts the 12 hours of darkness and the company that sails with the sun god through caverns and lakes of fire to the dawn. The Book of Gates names the thresholds and the watchful guardians who must be greeted in the right order. The Book of Caverns opens deep places where the enemies of the sun are punished and where the blessed are fed from hidden pools. In the tomb of Thutmose III, the figures run in spare lines of ochre and black, as if a scribe drew the netherworld out of a single breath. In the house of Seti, the first, the reliefs are cut deep and colored with a richness that looks like a fresh fruit split open. In the small tomb of a boy king, sealed and almost forgotten, the nested coffins and shrines turn the burial chamber into a blaze of gold, a human hope gilded as if light could be hammered into permanence. Above ground in the city of the living, the workmen of Deir el-Medina copied these chapters on scraps of limestone and on teaching boards, practiced the words until they were smooth and quick, and carried them back to their own tombs as abridged guides with a personal prayer added for a wife or a child. The valley itself became a ritual map. Each door carried a starry ceiling and a goddess of the sky arched in blue. Each corridor announced an hour, and each deep room promised that the sun would be born again if only the names were spoken. The secrecy of the place was a confession. Great pyramids had been too proud and too visible. Rock-cut chambers hid their treasure and their hope, while priests returned in the dark to lift mummies and cache them together when danger grew, protecting kings with humble thrift when glory had become a risk. In this vision of death, there is no surrender. The Egyptians conceded nothing to despair. They made law out of morality and magic out of memory. The heart was the book that recorded a life, and the gods would read it with calm eyes. If it was found equal to the feather, a door opened that did not close. The papyri and the carved walls are not curious myths set apart from the earth. They are contracts made visible. The living promised to feed the dead with offerings and names. The dead promised to guard the living and to bless their houses with cool north winds. The sun promised to rise, and the land promised to be fertile if Maat was kept. In the cool chambers of the valley, and in the quiet courtyards of village tombs, the same exchange was honored for centuries without breaking. The river taught Egypt that life is a cycle. The books taught Egypt that cycles can be kept by knowledge and by care. The people believed that a human being, rightly tended and rightly named, could step into the bark of the morning and never be turned away. Abydos lies where the desert steps close to the river and the wind hushes among low ridges of sand. There the earliest kings cut their tombs into the earth at the place later called el-Kab, and there the living came with jars of beer and small stone bowls to feed the dead. In time, the people said that one of those ancient graves was the resting place of Osiris himself. They brought stelae and set them in long rows along the sacred wall, each inscribed with a name and a plea to be remembered by the Lord of the West. The city became a theater of myth and state. In the temple of Seti I, the walls present a procession of royal names as if the king had called his fathers to witness his piety, and behind that temple sits the Osirion, a deep stone chamber ringed by water where a cavern-like hall suggests a tomb for a god who died and lived again. Each year, in the month of Seed, The priests carried a wooden shrine upon the boat called Neshmet, and the people followed from the town across the desert to the field of burial. The procession unfolded like a play. First went Wepwawet, the opener of the ways, his standard high, as if to clear a path through the world of the unseen. Then came the mourning of Isis and Nephthys, their voices raised in ritual laments that promised the broken body would be made whole. A mock battle erupted between the followers of Horus and the friends of Seth, order wrestling with disorder before a crowd that knew the stakes. At last, the bier of Osiris reached the place of rest, and seeds were planted in mold-shaped like the god, watered with Nile mud so that green shoots would rise from the dark as a sign that life answers death. An official of the 12th dynasty named Ikonofret left a stela describing how he prepared the bark of Wepwawet, fought the enemies of Osiris, and purified the road for the god. A sober witness that passion plays were more than poetry. Abydos in those days was a pilgrimage of the nation. The poor left little pots with their names scratched on them. The rich endowed chapels. All hoped that by standing in the dust of the god, they might share in his fate. The tale that shaped kingship began long before those processions and grew richer with each telling. It begins with Osiris, a just ruler who taught men to till and to share and to honor the gods, and with his brother Seth, strong and stormy and jealous. Seth slew Osiris and scattered the body. Isis searched the land, found the parts, bound them with linen, and with words stronger than iron breathed life into a husband who could not remain among the living. From that embrace came Horus, hidden in the marshes until his limbs were strong and his eyes were sharp. When he was grown, he came to claim the throne of his father. The gods assembled as a tribunal, and the case was argued without haste. The story is told most fully in a papyrus now called Chester Beatty, where the Ennead sits in council, where Seth boasts of strength and Horus of right, where Isis tricks the strong to show the truth, where Thoth heals the wounded eye and makes the measure of fullness, and where Neith gives wise counsel that the sun has the rightful claim. At the end, Ra and the elders award the crown to Horus and grant to Seth a place as thunder and as a defender of the nightly boat. The myth is not crude triumph. It admits that power matters, that the desert has its uses, that the storms must be harnessed and not denied. Yet it states clearly that rule is a moral thing. Kingship belongs to the lawful heir and to the God who restores equilibrium. The divine court speaks to the human court. The quarrel of brothers became the map of succession for 1,000 years. Every pharaoh breathed within that map. The king in life was Horus with the falcon on his serek, the eye restored and shining. In death, he was Osiris who sleeps and is reborn, father of the next Horus, who will take the white crown and the red crown and claim the two lands by right. The royal titulary placed these truths in stone. There was the Horus name, the name of the two ladies, the golden Horus, and the throne name joined to the personal name within the oval of the cartouche, all of it a theology written as grammar. Coronation staged the victory of legitimacy over force. The ruler took the crowns of south and north, received the flail and the crook, and made offerings to the Ennead to declare that he would uphold Maat and set his face against Isfet. When a reign began after turmoil, texts and scenes hinted that Horus had at last overcome Seth. When a king presented justice, he was said to present Ma'at to the gods as his first duty of each dawn. In Thebes during great festivals, oracles responded with nods and turns to the questions of the people, and their judgments were treated like echoes of that primeval council. At Abydos, at Busiris, at Memphis, the cycle of Osiris and Horus was enacted in different dialects of ritual. At Edfu, in the time of the Ptolemies, temple walls record the fights of Horus and Seth along the marshes and the lakes, as if to seal for all time the verdict that the ancestors reached. A farmer in the Delta, who planted an Osiris bed in damp soil, a noble who wore the Wadjet eye on his chest, a queen who took the title God's wife of Ammon and walked in procession with sistrum in hand. All of them lived within the story that said order will return and that a rightful son will heal what has been broken. Myth for the Egyptians was not a tale told at the fire to pass the night. It was a charter of the state and a promise to the dead and a balm for the living, and it was carried on the river from province to province until it felt as old as the stars that never set. In the season when the fields were seeded and the air was sweet with the first promise of growth, Abydos became a moving scripture. Priests lifted the shrine of Osiris onto the Neshmet boat and set out along a route that was part road and part memory, from the temple through the town to the sand fields that held the ancient tombs. The procession unfolded as a living book. Wepwat led with his standard as the opener of roads. Musicians beat time for rows of white-clad servers who carried offerings in baskets and jars. Isis and Nephthys were sung in voices that rose and fell like lamplight in a wind, mourning and conjuring in the same breath. The crowd watched a staged combat between the companions of Horus and the men of Seth, a ritual contest in which order must win so that seed will sprout. At the resting place of the god, priests planted the Osiris gardens, mold-shaped figures filled with Nile silt and barley that would green in a few days and promise that life was not finished. The Stela of Iker-Nofret tells us how a royal envoy prepared the bark, fought the enemies of Osiris, and purified the path, as faithful to duty as any soldier on a frontier. In later centuries, temple walls at Edfu and Dendera recorded the festival calendars month by month, listing processional days and recipes for incense and sacred cakes, and the routes that connected forecourts, birthhouses, and river harbors. Procession roads themselves were monuments to belief. At Karnak, an avenue of sphinxes once stretched all the way to Luxor, a stone river along which Amun would travel each year so that Thebes could see its god and the god could see his people. The festivals of Thebes were a dialogue between the living and the dead, and between the city and its gods. In the beautiful festival of the valley, the bark of Amun crossed the river to visit the west bank, where the cliffs of the necropolis rise like the ribs of the world. The god entered mortuary temples, and the people feasted among the tombs, sharing food with the blessed dead as if a great family had gathered in a courtyard at evening. In the festival of Opet, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, left Karnak and moved to Luxor Temple. The barks rested in way stations while crowds pressed close and lifted petitions. Oracles were given along these routes. The god in his shrine, swaying on the shoulders of priests, could be asked questions, and the bearers would feel the weight of the divine answer. A forward movement might be read as yes, a retreat as no. Stelae record judgments on inheritance and boundary stones, rulings on disputes too bitter for local elders, and even endorsements of future kings. The people of Deir el-Medina left testimony that they appealed to Amun and to Meretzega when quarrels tore their little village, and they believed that the god had listened. Ears carved on votive stelae declared that the sanctuary was a place where prayers were heard. In such moments, the separation between temple and street dissolved. The god emerged from the cool dark of the sanctuary into sun and dust, and the city became a moving court where divine will met human need. Kings learned to speak in the language of these rites when they needed to knit a torn country. After the civil wars of the First Intermediate Period, Mentuhotep of Thebes reunited the two lands and built his terraced temple against the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, a place where mountain and shrine hold each other in a solemn embrace. There he tied his rule to the cult of Osiris and to the martial favor of Montu, presenting himself as the Horus who restores order after chaos. The Middle Kingdom sharpened this art of sacred politics. The prophecy of Neferti, set in the court of an earlier king but likely composed for Amenemhat, foretold a ruler who would come from the south to heal the land. A mirror held up to the new dynasty to reflect legitimacy back with a holy light. The story of Sinuhe, a tale of exile and return, closed with the mercy of a king who clothes a faithful servant for burial and so acts as a steward of Ma'at in life and in death. Senusret endowed Karnak and Abydos, and the pilgrim traffic swelled, and with it the feeling that the throne and the gods were rowing the same boat. When the Hyksos were expelled, Ahmose carved that victory as a restoration of divine worship. Temples were reopened and endowed, and the old rites were said to breathe again. Amenhotep, the son of Hapu and later kings, built colossal courts and pylons at Luxor designed for the Opet processions so that the yearly journey of Amun would pass beneath their names. Hatshepsut filled her temple with scenes of a divine birth, where Amun himself approaches her mother and Khnum shapes her car on a potter's wheel. A claim that she did not merely inherit a throne, but was made for it in the workshop of creation. Thutmose IV left a dream stela between the paws of the Sphinx at Giza, telling how the buried monument spoke to him in sleep and promised kingship if he cleared the sand. A bargain between care for ancient holiness and the gift of rule. In the Ramesside age, the festivals became theaters for royal presence, as much as for divine grace. Ramesses II lined the river with pylons and courts and statues that watched the processions pass, and he celebrated jubilees that proclaimed vigor and rightful dominion. His scribes inscribed tales of victory and treaty, and his priests filled calendars with precise ritual steps for each day of each feast, a choreography that kept time itself obedient. Oracles touched politics as well as private life. Stelae and ostraca from Thebes and from the village of the tomb builders show that divine judgments settled lawsuits, named work leaders, and sometimes brought punishment to officials who had failed in their duty. The high priest of Amon in Thebes grew powerful, in part because festivals and oracles made him the daily face of the god to a city that believed. When times darkened, the same language of restoration returned. After the god Aten had been raised above all, and the old cults had fallen silent, a young Tutankhamun issued his restoration decree, which said that the temples had become ruins, that offerings had ceased, that the gods had turned away, and that now the altars smoked again and the statues were clothed. The people did not need a lesson to understand this claim. They had seen Amun carried through their streets. They had tasted the blessed bread that came from the altars after the offerings. They understood that to restore a festival was to restore a covenant. Thus the passion plays, the processions, and the oracles were not ornaments around the throne. They were the frame that held the picture steady. The country saw its gods move and speak, and it saw its rulers kneel and present Ma'at in the clear morning light. It was a politics of sacred time, where the calendar itself carried promises and proofs. In the harvest month, the Osiris gardens greened in a handful of days. In the days of Opet, the god visited the heart of the city. In the days of the valley, the living embraced their dead as companions. The throne spoke through these rhythms, and the people answered. When war came, kings swore to rebuild a shrine. When famine came, priests read the old records to learn what offerings had secured a higher flood in years past. In calm years, the rites turned like a mill wheel and ground the grain of faith into the bread of daily confidence. Egypt endured so long because it knew how to make belief walk under the sun and how to bring the river of myth into the streets. In the season when the fields were seeded and the air was sweet with the first promise of growth, Abydos became a moving scripture. Priests lifted the shrine of Osiris onto the Neshmet boat and set out along a route that was part road and part memory, from the temple through the town to the sand fields that held the ancient tombs. The procession unfolded as a living book. Wepwawet led with his standard as the opener of roads. Musicians beat time for rows of white-clad servers who carried offerings in baskets and jars. Isis and Nephthys were sung in voices that rose and fell like lamplight in a wind, mourning and conjuring in the same breath. The crowd watched a staged combat between the companions of Horus and the men of Seth, a ritual contest in which order must win so that seed will sprout. At the resting place of the god, priests planted the Osiris gardens, mold-shaped figures filled with Nile silt and barley that would green in a few days and promise that life was not finished. The stela of Iconofret tells us how a royal envoy prepared the bark, fought the enemies of Osiris, and purified the path, as faithful to duty as any soldier on a frontier. In later centuries, temple walls at Edfu and Dendera recorded the festival calendars month by month, listing processional days and recipes for incense and sacred cakes, and the routes that connected forecourts, birthhouses, and river harbors. Procession roads themselves were monuments to belief. At Karnak, an avenue of sphinxes once stretched all the way to Luxor, a stone river along which Amun would travel each year so that Thebes could see its god and the god could see his people. The festivals of Thebes were a dialogue between the living and the dead, and between the city and its gods. In the beautiful festival of the valley, the bark of Amun crossed the river to visit the west bank, where the cliffs of the necropolis rise like the ribs of the world. The god entered mortuary temples, and the people feasted among the tombs, sharing food with the blessed dead, as if a great family had gathered in a courtyard at evening. In the festival of Opet, Amun, Mut, and Khonsu left Karnak and moved to Luxor Temple. The barks rested in way stations, while crowds pressed close and lifted petitions. Oracles were given along these routes. The god in his shrine, swaying on the shoulders of priests, could be asked questions, and the bearers would feel the weight of the divine answer. A forward movement might be read as yes, a retreat as no. Stelae record judgments on inheritance and boundary stones, rulings on disputes too bitter for local elders, and even endorsements of future kings. The people of Dey el-Medina left testimony that they appealed to Amun and to Meretzega when quarrels tore their little village, and they believed that the god had listened. Ears carved on votive stelae declared that the sanctuary was a place where prayers were heard. In such moments, the separation between temple and street dissolved. The god emerged from the cool dark of the sanctuary into sun and dust, and the city became a moving court where divine will met human need. Kings learned to speak in the language of these rites when they needed to knit a torn country. After the civil wars of the First Intermediate Period, Mentuhotep of Thebes reunited the two lands and built his terraced temple against the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, a place where mountain and shrine hold each other in a solemn embrace. There he tied his rule to the cult of Osiris and to the martial favor of Montu, presenting himself as the Horus who restores order after chaos. The Middle Kingdom sharpened this art of sacred politics. The prophecy of Neferti, set in the court of an earlier king but likely composed for Amenemhat, foretold a ruler who would come from the south to heal the land. A mirror held up to the new dynasty to reflect legitimacy back with a holy light. The story of Sinuhe, a tale of exile and return, closed with the mercy of a king who clothes a faithful servant for burial, and so acts as a steward of Maat in life and in death. Senusret endowed Karnak and Abydos, and the pilgrim traffic swelled, and with it the feeling that the throne and the gods were rowing the same boat. When the Hyksos were expelled, Ahmose carved that victory as a restoration of divine worship. Temples were reopened and endowed, and the old rites were said to breathe again. Amenhotep, the son of Hapu, and later kings built colossal courts and pylons at Luxor, designed for the Opet processions, so that the yearly journey of Amun would pass beneath their names. Hatshepsut filled her temple with scenes of a divine birth, where Amun himself approaches her mother and Khnum shapes her car on a potter's wheel, a claim that she did not merely inherit a throne, but was made for it in the workshop of creation. Thutmose IV left a dream stela between the paws of the Sphinx at Giza, telling how the buried monument spoke to him in sleep and promised kingship if he cleared the sand. A bargain between care for ancient holiness and the gift of rule. In the Ramesside age, the festivals became theaters for royal presence, as much as for divine grace. Ramesses II lined the river with pylons and courts and statues that watched the processions pass, and he celebrated jubilees that proclaimed vigor and rightful dominion. His scribes inscribed tales of victory and treaty, and his priests filled calendars with precise ritual steps for each day of each feast, a choreography that kept time itself obedient. Oracles touched politics as well as private life. Stele and Ostraca from Thebes and from the village of the tomb builders show that divine judgment settled lawsuits, named work leaders, and sometimes brought punishment to officials who had failed in their duty. The high priest of Ammon in Thebes grew powerful, in part because festivals and oracles made him the daily face of the god to a city that believed. When times darkened, the same language of restoration returned. After the god Aten had been raised above all, and the old cults had fallen silent, a young Tutankhamun issued his restoration decree, which said that the temples had become ruins, that offerings had ceased, that the gods had turned away, and that now the altars smoked again, and the statues were clothed. The people did not need a lesson to understand this claim. They had seen Amun carried through their streets. They had tasted the blessed bread that came from the altars after the offerings. They understood that to restore a festival was to restore a covenant. Thus the Passion plays, the processions, and the oracles were not ornaments around the throne. They were the frame that held the picture steady. The country saw its gods move and speak, and it saw its rulers kneel and present Maat in the clear morning light. It was a politics of sacred time, where the calendar itself carried promises and proofs. In the harvest month, the Osiris gardens greened in a handful of days. In the days of Opet, the god visited the heart of the city. In the days of the valley, the living embraced their dead as companions. The throne spoke through these rhythms, and the people answered. When war came, kings swore to rebuild a shrine. When famine came, priests read the old records to learn what offerings had secured a higher flood in years past. In calm years, the rites turned like a mill wheel and ground the grain of faith into the bread of daily confidence. Egypt endured so long because it knew how to make belief walk under the sun and how to bring the river of myth into the streets. Night in Egypt belonged to small gods who grinned at the dark. When the last lamp guttered, and the courtyard cooled, and the jackals called from the canal banks, a family slept beneath painted rafters watched over by faces that were fierce and kind at once. On bed frames and cosmetic spoons and mirror handles, on faience pendants and clappers for music, the same guardians appeared again and again, as familiar as a mother's hands. Their names were spoken in low voices and in laughter. Their help was requested with the steadiness of habit. The great temples fed the sun and crowned the kings. But it was these smaller beings who stood at the threshold of the bedroom, and in the doorway of the birthroom, and in the hush that follows a child's cry. All of it rested on a conviction older than pyramids. The world itself had been made with power that Egyptians called Heka. This was not trickery. It was sanctioned force, a property of creation that the gods wielded, and that priests and healers learn to use in measured ways. In the oldest coffin spells a voice that calls itself Heka claims to have existed before the other gods and to have given breath to their works. The Memphite creed that praises Pa says that the world was shaped in the heart and spoken with the tongue, and that names give being. If the cosmos is made by thought and speech, then rightly spoken words and rightly made signs do not merely describe the world, they nudge it, they steady it, they turn its harms aside. The king invoked Heka each dawn when he raised Ma'at before the hidden statue and said the offering formula. The midwife and the village lector priest did the same when they drew a circle around a woman in labor and chanted the names of those who protect. In such actions, belief touched craft and never let go. At the center of the household pantheon stood Be-Ez, the dwarf with lion mane and feathered crown, tongue out, knives in hand, and a musician when laughter was needed more than fear. He leans on the footboards of beds carved in hard wood. He dances on the handles of mirrors where women painted their eyes green and their lips red. He shakes a rattle over a squalling infant until the shadows retreat. His ugly charm was by design. The crooked face terrifies what creeps in the night. The scholar who opens a cabinet in a museum in our own time still finds Be-Ez peeping from blue faience pendants, from cosmetic palettes, from small copper clappers used to beat time during feasts. Near him stands Taweret, the Great One, a pregnant hippopotamus upright, on hind legs with the back and tail of a crocodile, and a round belly that proclaims her office. She bears the Sa sign of protection or the Ankh, and her image hangs from cords across the bellies of expectant mothers. In the minds of the people, she kept watch like a seasoned midwife who has seen hard births and will not be frightened. Together these two, along with lion-headed protectors and snake catchers and friendly demons with knives, made a fence around the hearth. The tools of that fence can still be held in the hand. From Middle Kingdom, houses and tombs come wands cut from hippopotamus ivory, narrow crescents engraved with crowded scenes of protective beings. A dwarf with leonine mane and plumed headdress strides with a knife. A long-necked serpent twists. A frog-headed woman raises a blade. A cat stalks a scorpion. These are not idle decorations. The wand was drawn around mother and child to mark a sacred boundary. Words were said that invited the pictured helpers to attend. The hippo that once sank vessels in the river now guards the cradle in the form of its tusk. The crocodile whose jaws the fisherman feared now lends its back to Taweret as a sign that dangerous strength has been tamed and put to service. The gentler giants of the pantheon also came home. Hathor entered courtyards with the laughter of women and the clatter of music. At festivals, but also in evenings after work, the sistrum was shaken, and the Menat necklace was swung to please the Lady of Dendera, patroness of music, love, and good drink. Painted plaques show her cow ears peeking through a wig as she greets the faithful with a warmth that belongs to mothers and to taverns alike. Bastet, the cat of Bubastis, curled herself around doorways and chased vermin and ill luck with equal energy. Families kept cats because they loved them and because cats were useful, and somewhere in that companionship rose a devotion that filled the delta with bronze cat votives and left soft footprints across countless households. Herodotus, a foreigner, curious and sometimes credulous, wrote of a great festival at Bubastis where people sailed the canals and made merry, shouting and shaking rattles. Behind the color stands a truth that Egyptians carried everywhere. Joy is a form of piety. Music and perfume and shared food gladden the gods, and the gods in turn make the house feel safe. Amulets were the grammar of this everyday devotion. They were little words of power worn against the skin, each with a meaning learned by millers and nobles alike. The Wadjet eye held off illness and envy and made the body whole. The Jed pillar steadied the spine and promised well-being after a fall. The knot of Isis bound a blessing around the blood. The Ankh offered life, as plain and unarguable as water. Scarabs pressed with spells or simple names warmed against the breast and whispered to the heart that it should be light when the time of weighing came. Materials mattered. Blue and green faience shone like clear water and fresh fields and were considered potent. Carnelian burned like the sun and was good for vigor. Lapis called the night sky and the hair of gods. Gold was the flesh of Ra. Workshops at towns like Lahun and Memphis fired trays of faience amulets by the hundred. Molds repeated the same sacred shapes until the kiln itself seemed to intone a litany. Abaya did not need a priest to benefit, though blessing in a chapel joined the object to the god. A mother could purchase a small bundle of protection for a child as easily as she bought bread. When set upon a newborn or tied at the wrist of a traveler, these signs were not decoration alone. They were the syntax of hope. Heka did not stop at protection. It healed. That truth is everywhere in the medical papyri. The Ebers papyrus carries recipes for cough and for a belly that will not settle, for a tooth that throbs, for a burn that will not close, each with a plant or a resin or a plaster, and often with words to be spoken. A poultice of honey and grease covers a wound, and the healer whispers to a demon to go out from the flesh. The London Medical Papyrus offers treatments for pains of the womb and for bites of creatures that love the canals. The Brooklyn Papyrus gathers knowledge of snakes and of scorpions, naming each variety and the likely outcome, reciting invocations to the gods while applying oil or beer and pressed herbs. There is no quarrel in these pages between medicine and magic. They are two hands joined. The practitioner is a servant of Sekhmet when wrath must be turned away, and of Thoth when learning must be exact, and of Isis when a mother's magic is needed more than any charm. A reader can feel the presence of real illness in these lines, and the patient steadiness with which Egyptians answered it. The most vivid expression of healing Heka stands in polished stone. In town shrines and in houses of higher rank, there was Sippi of Horus, staley carved with a boy god standing on crocodiles and gripping snakes and scorpions in his fists. The image is a confidence. Harm is caught and made small. Around the picture run spells in which Isis tells how she saved her son from poison and how she calls upon Ra to open the channels of life. The greatest of these monuments is the Metanix stela, cut in the last native dynasty and covered on every side with invocations and myths. The ritual use is practical and beautiful. Water is poured over the surface and allowed to run down the carved words. The patient drinks that water, which now carries the strength of the text. It is the same logic as the offering that becomes divine because a name is spoken. The liquid takes the shape of the writing and transfers that shape to the body. In countless houses, smaller Sippi worked the same grace. A child who cried from a sting was given water washed over a little Horus on crocodiles, while a mother recited lines she knew by heart. Other rites moved between home and temple, as need demanded. A man might wear a small papyrus, inscribed with a spell against nightmares tied in linen at the neck. A woman in labor might be seated upon a birthing stool carved with tawered, so that the very seat reminded the body that it was helped. A doorway might be painted with the scene of a lion-headed guardian barring the path to what should not enter. A traveling merchant might carry a miniature shrine with a tiny BEs glued to a stick so that he could plant his protector in the earth by the fire at night. The lector priest who served in the great house of a god would sometimes make side visits to homes for a fee, reading out of his book of rituals, placing bread and beer in a simple offering before a clay image, and then burning incense so that the corner of the house smelled for a time like the holy court. The poor did not lack for these things. Clay can be shaped by hand, and a line scratched by a child can call a god if spoken over with love. The boundary between lawful charm and harmful sorcery was watched, though seldom with the fury seen in later ages. The state punished those who wrote curses to cripple a neighbor, or who dared to aim at the king with poison words. Tales from the time when Greek and Egyptian ways mingled tell of princes who collected books of power and sometimes misused them, and of the stern lessons that followed. Yet the everyday practice of Heka was not feared. It was an obligation as much as a privilege to protect a newborn, to cool a fever with words and with a poultice, to hang an amulet before a journey, to plant a small Osiris bed in a season of doubt. These were gestures by which a household kept faith with the first morning. In this quieter sphere, the gods showed their tender faces. Amun might be hidden and vast in Karnak, but in a courtyard he was the north wind that a father begged for his child. Hathor was less a star goddess than a cup of sweet beer, and a song that eased the neck after weaving. Bastet was not only a patroness of cities, but a warm animal that taught children to be gentle. Bees was laughter after a hard day. Taret was the firm hand on the thigh during a contraction when the world narrowed to breath and pain. The spells never forgot the larger truths. They named Ra and Osiris, and Thoth and Reshep and Serket and Sekhmet in their proper places, and they traced the first stories as if new each time. But in the small hours under flat roofs, mythology became a craft of care. Statues grin and frown and brandish knives across ivory wands because people knew that fear yields to images of courage. The little stelae pour water because people knew that words can sink into matter and then into flesh. Heka, spoken rightly, was the people's share in creation. It was how a family in a mud brick house participated in the morning of the world. When the last color faded from the courtyard and the hearth threw up its small red heart, a different Egypt began to speak. It spoke in low prayers before a daubed niche where a clay image sat among dried lotus and the wick of a saucer lamp. It spoke in the whisper of a woman who touched a pendant of Tauret and asked for an easy night for the child at her breast. It spoke in the scrape of a reed pen across a potsherd that would become a message for a grandfather long buried. Temples crowned with pylons and obelisks ruled the riverbanks by day, but the old religion was equally alive in rooms where bread steamed and laundry dried, where cats slept on cool floors, and where the soft rustle of linen was an answer to fear. The house had its own liturgy. A shelf in the main room or a shallow window niche held a little altar. A small painted stela showed a god with a forward hand or a pair of human ears that promised a hearing. A blue faience BEs leaned against a bowl of barley and a sprig of henna. A model offering table waited for crumbs and drops of beer. Names were spoken. The air changed. Childbirth drew the gods closest. When labor began, the doorposts were marked with figures of protective beings, and a circle was traced with a wand of hippopotamus ivory cut and carved with a press of friendly demons who brandished knives against what could not be seen. The woman sat on a birthing stool in a room made warm and dim. Midwives rubbed her hips with scented oil and sang the names of Hathor and Taweret, and the lector priest, if one could be hired, recited the marsh tale where Isis protected her hidden son from bites and poison. In a house of the Middle Kingdom, there stood a birth brick, painted with a dancing woman and a newborn, and guardians who smiled with sharp teeth, a square of mud made sacred by art and by use. An amulet of the knot of Isis touched the belly. When the crisis passed and the first cry came, a BE's rattle shook and laughter rose, because laughter itself was a ward. In the days that followed, a garlanded cradle carried the child beneath a doorway inscribed with blessing, and water that had been poured across a little Horus on crocodiles was given to drink. Cool and sweet and strong with words, the breast offered milk, and the gods offered courage, and the house became a temple until the mother could rise and thank those who had sat through the night. The art of healing moved between courtyard and sanctuary with the calm of practice. A mother with a fevered child simmered a potion of figs and beer and gave it while reciting a line that called on Sekhmet to turn her face from wrath to mercy. A father set a poultice of honey and linen on a burn and spoke a small confession, promising to mend a quarrel as part of the cure. If the bite of a scorpion made a hand swell, the family poured water over a sippus carved with the boy Horus, who treads on crocodiles and crushes serpents, and drank what had touched the spells, as if the letters themselves could swim down the throat and set the blood right. The Ebers scrolls and the London recipes and the Brooklyn roll of snakes show how much was known and how much was hoped. Every charm repeats the logic of creation. A named thing has less power over one who knows its name. Disease was often addressed as a person and ordered to depart. The lesson is steady. The gods gave speech to the world. Humans may answer with speech, and by that act, both will and world are moved. The dead were not strangers to the house. Their doors stood in silent walls across the river, but their attention was welcome in the living rooms of their descendants. When trouble grew stubborn, a person might write a letter to a dead mother or to a brother or to a wife, list the grievance with the plainness kept for family, and beg for help. One such bowl preserves a husband's complaint that his wife haunts him because he took another, followed by a plea that she cease if he has dealt fairly with the children. Another ostracon holds a request that a father asked the gods to lift illness from a grandchild, with the promise of a little feast at the tomb if the petition is heard. These letters were carried to the cemetery and left with simple offerings. They tell us that Egyptians believed love and duty did not end with burial. Bonds remained, and words could cross the frontier as surely as a bark crosses from one bank to the other. In the corners of some houses at Deir el-Medina were set curious busts of limestone, human heads and shoulders with large eyes and a slight smile, which scholars call ancestor figures. People placed flowers and food before them and whispered, as one would before a person who listens. The house was populated by the beloved dead as well as by the gods, and both could be asked to help mend what had frayed. The workman's village of Deir el-Medina gives the clearest window into these habits. The town lies on a high shelf above the fields, a neat double row of mud brick houses laid along a single street, where the masons and painters and carvers who cut the royal tombs lived with their families in the reigns of the great kings of Thebes. Their days were measured with scribal exactness. They worked 8-day weeks in the Valley of the Kings and returned to their homes for rest days when they mended sandals and copied texts and drank beer with friends. Their walls were painted with images of Bees and Taweret, and of the cobra goddess Meretzega, who watched from the pyramid-shaped peak above the necropolis. Their little chapels stood in courtyards with stellae that show hands lifted in prayer and sometimes nothing but ears carved in rows, a blunt declaration that the god hears. The stela of a man named Neferabu tells in its carved lines how he did wrong and was struck blind by Meretzega, and how he prayed and was forgiven and saw again, and how he vowed to tell others that the goddess is merciful as well as stern. On an ostracon, a scribe copied a hymn that calls Ammon the one who comes at the voice of the poor man and who saves the timid from the strong. Another fragment preserves a dream book that lists sleeping visions and their meanings, good and ill, along with brief counsels of what to do on waking. The people of this village asked oracles when disputes arose. The god in his portable shrine swayed forward for yes and backward for no, and verdicts were written down with the same care given to the cutting of a royal cartouche. When wages failed in a hard year under a weary king, these artisans staged the first recorded strike. They marched to a mortuary temple and shouted their hunger to the images of deified kings, a startling confession that they expected justice from those who had become gods. They were pious and practical in one breath. Songs drifted through these streets that speak to us still. Papyrus rolls from Thebes carry love poems that call on Hathor as the mistress of delight, and that describe a young man who smears his hair with sweet oil and waits outside his beloved's door. Sick with longing and casting lots to see a favorable sign, the sistrum rings in these verses as clearly as it does in the forecourt of Dendera. The poets call their lovers sisters and brothers in the old Egyptian way, and promise to bring myrrh and pomegranates and collars of beads. They ask Hathor to bring the two of them together in a courtyard where palm shadows lie cool as shade on wine. In other stanzas, a woman speaks and says she will seek her beloved as Isis sought Osiris, a daring pledge, and that she will keep watch as Tauret keeps the door of a birthroom. The sacred is never far from the tender. In work songs and boat songs, and in the playful verses of banquets, the gods are intimate witnesses and sometimes accomplices. The traffic between house and temple ran both ways each week of the year. On the days of public procession, a god came out in a gilded shrine and moved along the streets. A woman in a doorway lifted her child to see. A man in a linen kilt offered a tiny oil lamp and a bouquet of cornflowers and asked for success in a lawsuit. The shrine slowed when petitions were many, and the bearers felt the pull of a yes or a no. The same people later walked to the river stairs of a great temple and received blessed bread or beer that had been placed before the statue and then returned to the faithful as a share of grace. The bread tasted like any other bread, but it carried a confidence that is not so easily measured. In calmer times, when no procession came, families made pilgrimages to nearby chapels. They left little votive figures of cats for Bastet or cows for Hathor, faience plaques shaped as ears and eyes and hands, a language of offerings as steady as daily bread. In the late period, people sometimes wore small decrees from an oracle written on papyrus and folded into packets, an amulet made of an official word. The common thread is simple. A promise spoken by a god or before a god was thought to cling to things. One might wear that promise against the heart and feel braver. Beneath these rites runs a river of ethics. The Book of the Dead teaches that the heart must balance against the feather and that the negative confession is a list of very human decencies. The stelae of Deir el-Medina and the prayers of ordinary folk repeat the same lesson in unadorned speech. I have kept my word, I have measured fairly, I have not robbed the temple, I have not cheated a widow. I have fed my old mother. The house altar was not only a place to ask, it was a place to remember. A man who drank too much at a feast hung a wadjet eye over his bed and promised to do better. A scribe who shorted a ration wrote a prayer and carried it tucked under his belt until he had made amends. A woman who gossiped and caused pain brought a small loaf to the statue of Hathor and left it with tears, and then went home and quieted her tongue. Myth laid the pattern. Heka provided the tools. Domestic life supplied the daily rehearsals of conscience. If one stands in a restored house at Deir el-Medina on a late afternoon and looks at the marks cut into the plaster of a private shrine, the outline of a god and the faint traces of a bouquet and the names of a family, the distance between king and commoner collapses. The sun still goes down behind the ridge where the royal valley lies. The desert breathes its dry breath. A child runs along the street and leaves a footprint in the dust. Inside the house, a woman smooths a stela with her palm and lights a lamp. She asks for nothing grand, a safe birth, a fever to break, a quarrel to end with fairness, a harvest that will fill the jars. She speaks to Bees and to Taweret and to Amun who hears and to Meretsega who watches. And she looks at the ears on the stone and believes that someone listens. In such moments, Egypt's mythology becomes utterly near. Creation is not only a god on a first hill. It is a circle drawn around a bed. Judgment is not only a scale in a grand hall. It is a heart that chooses to be kind. The gods walk the great courts of Karnak in procession, but they also sit quietly on a shelf in a room that smells of bread and smoke, and they nod when a tired father whispers over his sleeping child. The years of division began with a rumor blown up from the marshes of the north and hardened into a fact that sat like a weight on the chest of the two lands. Foreign chiefs had made a court in the delta. They held the eastern harbors and the long mouths of the Nile. They called their capital Avaris, and they took the title of kings. Later ages would name them the Hyksos, rulers of hill country, come down into the green. They were not strangers to Egyptian ways. They wrote their names in cartouches and kept scribes and made offerings in proper form. They were also new. They brought the horse and the fast chariot, and they favored a storm god whom Egyptians called Seth when he wore Egyptian dress and Baal when he spoke with a Levantine voice. At Avaris rose shrines where Seth, Lord of Thunder, took on the strength of a foreign sky. In their houses, people prayed as they had always done. In their courts, the invaders adopted the pomp of the south. At the river's bend in Thebes, a native line kept its dignity and sharpened its swords. The gods watched from their hilltops and their riverfronts and learned new names without giving up the old. The second intermediate period stretched like a rope pulled from both ends. In Thebes, men swore by Ammon, the hidden one who hears in the wind, and by Montu, the bull of war whose plume shook when chariots left the gate. In the Delta, men swore by Seth, Lord of Avarice, who could bring rain and victory, and whose face stared from seals with the muzzle of a desert beast. Stories grew around the two courts. One tells of Apophis of the north sending a message to Seqenenre of Thebes to silence the hippopotamuses in the sacred lake, because their bellows kept the northern king from sleep. It is a fable of insult, yet it carries a cool truth. The quarrel was framed as a wound to Mart. What was proper in Thebes was an offense in Avaris. The Theban kings made war a sacrament. The Kamos Stela speaks of pushing back the northerners and breaking their ships, and of reopening temples whose doors had gone quiet. The oath behind the spear was religious before it was political. To restore the rights was to set the world upright again. The frontier bled ideas as well as men. In Sinai, at the turquoise mines of Serabit, Egyptian prayers to Hathor, mistress of the sky and of blue stone, met the tongues of Canaanite workers who scratched early letters into rock. In the Delta and the eastern towns, deities of the Levant stood beside Egyptian ones on small stelae and amulets. Resheph the archer appeared with plume and beard, fierce and useful on a soldier's pendant. Astarte and Anat, riders and war maidens of the sea road, sometimes shared an altar with Seth, and later in New Kingdom, Tails would become his companions in arms. Kodesh, a goddess of delight, stood nude on a lion in panels made for houses where laughter was not thought profane. The Egyptians did not break when they met these faces. They bent, and then they knitted. They called Amun by titles that made him lord of all foreign lands, and folded the strange into the known, as a weaver adds a bright thread to an old cloth. At Memphis and Heliopolis, priests kept the high creeds of Ptah and Ra without surrender, while on the margins, people learned that a god who kept travelers safe on the desert road was as welcome as a god who ruled a city gate. The Hyksos also learned in their turn. At Avaris, archaeologists have found traces of Egyptian ritual floors and rich burials with native forms. The kings of the north used Egyptian scribes and adopted regnal customs. Their thunder god accepted Egyptian incense and Egyptian hymns. This sharing did not soften the iron in the hearts of Theban princes. The southern kings spoke again and again of restoration. Seqenenre died with wounds on his skull that looked like the blunt report of close war. Kamose pushed north with boats and chariots and left his boasting on stone because he wanted the gods to read it as well as men. Aphmos took Avaris in due time and drove the remnant into the Levant. The victors did the work they had promised. They reopened sanctuaries. They endowed offerings. They rebuilt walls and swept shrines and spoke to gods with voices that did not tremble. Yet the memory of the storm did not fade. In later reigns, a commemorative stela in the north counted 400 years for Seth of Avaris, as if even those who had suffered under his banner were forced to admit that he had had his season. The god of necessary violence remained part of the world. His image stood in places where strength was required, and his name clung to soldiers and kings. It was the character of the land to accept even an enemy god if he could be made to work for Ma'at. Southward, another current joined the river of religion. In Nubia, the court at Napata listened to Amun at Jebel Barkal, where a cliff in the shape of a coiled serpent throws a deep shadow at noon. This Amun was the same and not the same as Amun of Thebes. He was older here and more sudden. When Theban armies marched into Kush, they brought temples and hymns, and in return they found Dedan and other southern gods waiting with long memories of their own. The two traditions embraced. In the centuries that followed, Nubian kings would one day wear the crowns of Egypt and claim the blessing of Amun from both mountains at once. Even in the troubled time of the Hyksos, Egypt learned that borders are not walls. They are markets where gods are traded and married off and adopted, and given new epithets that make the map of heaven look like the map of the earth. The change began softly in Thebes when a young king raised new altars to the sun and ordered open courts for a god who needed no walls. He was born Amenhotep, beloved of Amun, yet in the early years of his reign he set his face toward a disk of light called the Aten. Within the precinct of Karnak he built great courts without roofs, forests of offering tables under the open sky, and pylons faced with small limestone blocks that could be set with speed. There the sun did not shine upon a veiled statue in a dark chamber. It fell full upon bread and flowers, and slaughtered bulls while priests chanted names as long as a river. As the devotion sharpened, so did the resolve. The king renamed himself Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. The old gods receded. The name of Amun was hammered from stone, even in the cartouches of the king's own father. Shrines were sealed. Revenues that had fattened ancient cults were diverted into new granaries where sunlight was the only image required. In the 5th year, the king sought a fresh horizon. He sailed north along the river and chose a bend where cliffs open in a wide bay. He carved boundaries stele into the living rock and swore an oath that this ground, which he called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, belonged to the sun and to no other god. A city rose with astonishing haste. There were broad streets and palaces with painted floors that showed water and birds and flowering trees, and there were 2 great temple complexes whose sanctuaries were courtyards open to the sky. The sun fell on thousands of white altars like snow that does not melt. In the palaces, the king and queen Nefertiti appeared in scenes that felt more like a family album than royal propaganda. They sat together beneath the disk whose rays ended in tiny hands that offered the ankh to their nostrils. They kissed their daughters. They leaned against each other in chariots. Their faces were long and thoughtful. Their bellies and hips and necks were drawn with a softness that earlier ages had not granted to kings. The art was a theology. Life itself came straight from light, not from a god hidden in a shrine. The royal household was the sole proper court for that light. The creed that flowered here is preserved in hymns carved on the tomb walls of courtiers. The great hymn to the Aten praises the sun that wakes the birds and calls the herds from their stalls, that steadies the ships on the river and gives breath to Syrian hills and to Nubian deserts as readily as to Egyptian fields. Day is the gift, and night is the test. When the Aten sets, the world sleeps as if dead, and when he rises, hearts awaken. There is little interest in caverns, or judges, or maps of the night. Osiris is quiet in these texts. The judgment of the heart is set aside. What matters is to live in the sun while the sun gives life, to breathe the pure light through the royal couple who alone can properly worship on behalf of the land. No cult statue received offerings. The Aten had no face a human hand could carve. The image was the disk and the rays. The priests of Amun and of other gods found their estates emptied. Tombs at Akhetaten speak of a hope to bask in sunlight forever rather than to stand before Osiris. Yet even here the old habits murmured in corners. In the workman's village near the new city, little figurines of Bees and Taweret have been found in houses, tucked away as if grand policy could not follow a mother into a birthroom. Faith in the home is patient, and it does not forget how to draw a circle on the floor when a child is sick. The end came with the quiet violence of court death and thin harvests. Akhenaten died in his city by the cliffs. A shadow of a successor flickers in the record, perhaps a co-ruler who took the crowns for a season, perhaps the queen herself beneath another name. The story is broken stone and guesswork. What is clear is that a boy soon stood in the place of the king. His name at first honored the Aten, then it honored Amun. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, living image of the hidden one. The court moved back toward the old centers. A stele of restoration speaks with the indignation of a people who felt abandoned. The temples were fallen and the shrines were overgrown. The gods had turned their backs. Now the statues were clothed, and the sanctuaries reopened, and the offerings restored as in the first time. I guided the boy, and wore the crowns after him. Horemheb, a general who understood both sword and seal, followed and made the erasure complete. He issued edicts against corruption. He chiseled out the names of the heretic court. He dismantled the city of Akhetaten stone by stone. The small blocks that had once held sunlight were carried south and stuffed inside new pylons at Karnak as filler, a pragmatic burial that ensured later kings would walk past the husk of the revolution without seeing it. The consequence of this storm was a paradox. The priesthood that had been humbled emerged more secure than before. The kings of the Ramesside age poured wealth into Amun's house with a lavish hand. Karnak grew like a forest of stone. Luxor shone at festival times with barks and incense. The great Harris papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III lists donations in a prose so heavy with numbers that it feels like a wall. Land, cattle, ships, workshops, and tens of thousands of laborers were assigned to the gods, most of all to Amun. The office of God's wife of Amun, held by royal women, gathered estates and influence until it stood as a power beside the high priest. Oracles in Thebes judged disputes, named officials, and guided processions that the city believed held the rhythm of the world. Hymns to Amun in these centuries often speak with a language so elevated that it sounds like a single god dressed in many names. You are one, beside whom there is none other, say the priests in their courts of light. The old plurality remained, yet the memory of Aten lingered as a caution and as a fragment of thought. It had shown that a king could overreach, and that a single god could not carry the love of a people who still needed Isis in the marshes, and Osiris in the tomb, and Bes at the bedpost. In the end, Egypt returned to the many with a deeper sense that the hidden can be all-embracing, and that Ma'at survives even the hottest light. After the thunder of the Ramesside age, the valley learned the grammar of uncertainty. The third intermediate period unfolded from about 1069 to 664 before our era, like a tapestry pulled at the edges. Libyan families with long service in the army took thrones in the delta, while Thebes in the south bowed not to a king, but to the high priest of Ammon, whose oracles and estates made him a prince in all but name. Egypt did not break so much as it federated. Bubastis, Tanis, Memphis, and Thebes each tended its gods with local pride. Inscriptions from Karnak record oracular judgments that settled lawsuits and named officials, proof that the hidden gods still ruled the public square. The Chronicle of Prince Ozorkon speaks of temple endowments and famine relief, a sober window onto an economy that tried to keep Ma'at when coffers ran thin. At Bubastis, festival reliefs of Osorkon, the second show music, and feasting that echo the old jubilees, a deliberate assertion that sacred time moved forward even when dynasties overlapped. Most telling of all was the rise of the god's wife of Ammon in Thebes, a royal woman whose adoption was sealed on granite stelae and whose estates, choirs, and barks became an anchor of the south. The office kept the river of offerings flowing and turned succession into ritual rather than civil war. Egypt survived by putting politics into cult and cult into politics until the two could not be told apart. From the far bends of the river, another current entered with conviction and grace. In the hills above Napata stood Jebel Barkal, a cliff that looks like a coiled serpent and a crown, and there Amun revealed himself to kings of Kush. Pie sailed north with a piety that reads like a sermon carved into stone. His victory stela tells how he purified himself before shrines, how he scolded Delta rulers for neglecting offerings, how he accepted surrender only after the local gods had been appeased with clean rites. He called himself beloved of Amun of Napata and beloved of Amun of Thebes, a double devotion that stitched Upper Egypt to Nubia with liturgy and with law. His successor, Shabaka, placed a black slab of basalt in a temple court, the stone we call the Shabaka stone, which records an old Memphite theology. Ptah conceives in the heart and speaks with the tongue, and the world answers by coming into being. This was not archaism for ornament. It was a claim that rightful rule is made of thought, word, and offering, not of iron alone. Taharqa left pylons and colonnades at Karnak and shrines at Kawa and at Gebel Barkal, where Amun wears a ram's head and gazes over the desert. Reliefs show kings receiving crowns from a god whose hands are as real as a priest's. Oracles named heirs. The office of the god's wife passed to Ammonidis of Kush, and then to Shepen-Wepet and to Nitocris, by formal adoption recorded on the great Theban stela that bears Nitocris's name, a choreography of power that let Thebes accept new masters without breaking faith. Even when Assyrian armies came down like a hard wind, and Thebes felt the sack in the year 663, the Kushite kings withdrew to Napata with their priesthood and their scriptures intact. They carried Egypt with them in hymns and in law, and waited by a holy mountain for the next turn of the river. The late period opened with a deliberate return to first principles. Psamtik of Sais reunited the two lands and walked into Thebes to accept the adoption of Nitocris as God's wife, binding Delta and South with a ritual marriage. In the courts of Sai, the theology of Neith, the deep mother whose waters precede creation took on new life, while artists carved statues and reliefs in styles that looked back to the Old Kingdom with a scholar's love. Naucratis in the Delta welcomed Greek merchants, and the gods learned new admirers without losing their native voices. The Serapeum at Saqqara received the great burials of the Apis bulls with long corridors and rooms of basalt, while at Armand, The Buchis bull had its own sanctuaries, and at Heliopolis the Mnevis bull wore wreaths in processions that made cattle into liturgy. Catacombs multiplied for birds and beasts dear to the gods. Ibises for Thoth, falcons for Horus, cats for Bastet, dogs for Anubis. Each votive was a promise in flesh and feather that prayers would be carried to the right ears. Funerary belief continued to grow its library. The books of breathing condensed older spells into handier guides that could sail with a clerk or a mason who could not afford a full papyrus of chapters. Then came the Persians. Cambyses entered Memphis in the year 525 and took the double crown. A statue of the courtier Uja-Horasnet tells how he taught the new lord the courtesies due to Neith and how the royal house purified its approach to the shrines. Darius built at Hybis in the Karga oasis and left canal stelae that speak of joining seas to river and of favor from Ra for a foreign king who kept the offering schedules. Egyptian scribes wrote Pharaoh beside Persian names and carved the king before Amun, as tradition required. When the first Persian rule ended, native courts rose again and set more statues in more temples. When the second Persian rule returned in the 4th century, the priests once more tended the altars with the same measured hands. Through all these turns, the oracles of Amun continued to nod yes or no. The god's wife kept estates and choirs at Thebes, and the animal cults flourished like fields after a strong flood. Empire altered borders and pay sheets and garrisons. It did not silence the daily rite. The gods received bread and beer at dawn, and Egypt told itself that Ma'at could endure foreigners as long as the scales in the Hall of Truth stayed level, and the sun still took his boat each night. The conquerors who followed Alexander learned quickly that the Nile rewards those who speak its language. In Alexandria, the Ptolemies built palaces that caught the sea light and libraries where scholars sorted the books of many nations, yet in their reliefs they appear in the old crowns. Offering Ma'at to the gods with hands held as precisely as any son of Ra. They also sponsored a god who could look both to Greek harbors and to Egyptian shrines without blinking. His name was Serapis. Many modern scholars see in him a fusion of Osiris and the sacred bull of Memphis, with elements of Zeus and of the lord of the underworld. Ancient writers left conflicting tales, some claiming that the image came from a distant city and others that a master sculptor shaped a new form in Alexandria. The debates are part of his nature. Serapis wore a grain measure on his head to promise plenty. He sat enthroned with a dog of the underworld at his side to remind men that death is a doorway. In his Alexandrian Serapeum, a terrace of colonnades and statues and sacred vaults, Greeks and Egyptians could kneel in the same perfumed air. Yet the old Apis bull at Memphis still kept his court, and the Osirian mysteries at Abydos still drew pilgrims who planted gardens of barley in the shape of a god. The new cult did not erase the old, it braided them. Isis took the river road and then the sea lanes and did not stop. Sailors loved her for steady winds and safe harbors, and merchants honored her with first fruits from their cargoes. On Delos, where ships crowded the quays, shrines to Isis and to Serapis gleamed beside stows and treasuries, and dedications in Greek promised thanks for rescue from storms. In the Piraeus near Athens, a sanctuary of Isis welcomed those who sought her mother with wide arms. In Italy, the songs of Isis sounded in Pompeii, where frescoes show her priests with shaved heads and white linen and censers that pour out sweet smoke. In Rome itself, the Iseum Campens rose on the Campus Martius, its black basalt statues and obelisks planted in a foreign city like cuttings that took root. The cult met suspicion and favor by turns, but it endured because it offered a personal covenant in a world of empires. A woman could call Isis my lady and expect an answer. A sailor could promise a vow and return to hang a plaque that named the day and the wind that spared him. The Greek magical papyri, copied in Roman Egypt, fold this devotion into handbooks of ritual where Egyptian heka and Greek invocations mingle without shame. A spell might call Isis by Egyptian epithets and also by names that echo the mysteries of other lands, while Hermes and Thoth are treated as one wise god who teaches letters to magicians as well as to kings. Inside Egypt, the temples became encyclopedias of memory. At Edfu, on the west bank of the river, masons laid the first stones of the great house of Horus in the reign of Ptolemy III, and the last inscriptions were cut under a Roman emperor. The walls carry long sacred histories that priests said were copied from ancient writings kept in the libraries of earlier shrines. There is a cosmogony where the first mound rises and the falcon receives his domains. There are ritual dramas in which Horus hunts the companions of Seth with harpoons, each thrust preserving the world from the monster of the marsh. The calendar of festivals marches across the stone like an army of days. The writing is dense, the scenes are precise, and yet the mood is not nostalgic. It is triumphant. To carve a myth is to keep it alive. At Dendera, the temple of Hathor rose with delicate capitals shaped like the face of the goddess, and with a birthhouse where the child Ihi is celebrated with sistrum and song. On a ceiling now far from its home, the signs of the zodiac wheel in painted relief, a map of sky that shows how Egyptian thought could welcome the star lore of foreign sages and translate it into the language of the Nile. At Kom Ombo, a double temple honored Sobek the crocodile, and Haro-Eris, the elder Horus, a frank admission that the river gives both danger and protection. Farther south at Philae, an island so lovely that travelers praised it for centuries, Isis ruled as queen of boundaries. Her priests kept alive rites for Osiris and for the child Horus, and her bark traveled in processions that made the water itself a sanctuary. In later centuries, the last hieroglyphic inscription would be cut there, and the last demotic prayer would be scratched by a pilgrim in the age of emperors. The place felt like the final green before the cataracts. The language of power learned new scripts and kept the old. The priests who crowned Ptolemy V issued a decree at Memphis in the year 196 before our era that praised the king and set out honors for the gods. It was carved in hieroglyphs for the temples, in Demotic for the courts, and in Greek for the council houses. The stone fell in later ages and broke, yet its words once read in 3 scripts allow us to recover the lost voice of pharaohs. We call it the Rosetta Stone. Earlier decrees had laid the path. The Canopus decree under Ptolemy III honored a princess and proposed a reform of the calendar to add a day each 4 years so that the seasons would not drift. A later Memphis decree recorded the victory at Raphia and set festivals in motion to mark a king who fought like Horus and who brought back images that had been carried off by foreign enemies. These texts were not flattery alone. They are contracts that show how priesthood and throne traded gifts. The crown endowed temples and confirmed privileges. The temples offered ritual, festival, and language that wrapped foreign rulers in native legitimacy. It is not an accident that Roman emperors allowed themselves to be shown in Egyptian reliefs with the crook and the flail and the double crown. Augustus carved his name on gateways and built at Philae for Isis and for Mandulis. Hadrian raised a city called Antinoopolis on the east bank and fashioned a god from his grief, Oserantinus, a youth who died in the river and rose in the language of Osiris to receive worship in gymnasia and in village shrines. Empire became myth, and myth became empire in a trade that both sides understood. In these centuries, the people kept the same devotions that had comforted their ancestors. They brought mummified ibises to the catacombs of Thoth and left bronze cats at Bubastis. They wore amulets of faience shaped as ankhs and wadjet eyes. They asked oracles along procession routes and carved stelae with ears to promise that prayers would be heard. The funerary papyri grew shorter for the poor and more elegant for the rich. The books of breathing condensed the old spells into forms that a clerk could afford, while wealthy families commissioned portraits in tempera on wooden panels to place upon the faces of their mummies, eyes bright and unafraid. In city and village, Greek and Egyptian words mingled in markets and at doorways, but in sanctuaries, the ritual language pursued its careful course. The sun still rose as a scarab and sailed the sky in a bark. Osiris still slept and woke. Isis still searched the papyrus beds and found what was lost. The new gods walked beside the old and were not ashamed to borrow their names. Faith moved along the waterways in barges loaded with wine and oil and in minds that could carry 100 titles for a single hidden presence. Egypt under the Ptolemies and under Rome did not abandon its gods. It taught them new languages and sent them abroad with a confidence born of flood and field. The old order dimmed slowly, like a lamp that burns lower, while the wick still glows. In the 4th century of our era, emperors who had once poured wine before Serapis and Isis turned their faces toward the cross. Edicts came like the tolling of a bell. The faith of the Christ was first permitted, then raised above rivals, and at last declared the measure of the realm in the reign of Theodosius. Sacrifices were forbidden. Temples were shut, their endowment seized or reassigned, though local practice varied with governors and with the stubbornness of towns. In Alexandria, the Serapeum, whose terraces had looked upon the sea with serene pride, fell in a storm of shattered stone and prayer, an event told by church historians who saw victory, and by later writers who heard lament, yet the gods did not vanish in a night. At Dendera, at Edfu, at Kom Ombo, Christian crosses were cut into the soft limestone, and small chapels were made inside courts where sistrums had once rung. Priests plastered over processional scenes and set altars before doorways that had framed barks of gold. At Philae, last of the great sanctuaries, Isis held her island through the patience of border treaties and the needs of trade. Travelers from Nubian tribes brought gifts for Mandulus and for the old queen, while bishops in nearby towns preached against the rites. On the gate of Hadrian at Philae, a priest left the last known hieroglyphic inscription in the year 394, a brief prayer signed by a name that reads as Esmet Akom. A generation later, a demotic hand wrote the last of its script. Justinian, advised by officials and monks, ordered the formal closure in the 6th century and the removal of Isis to Constantinople, and Procopius tells that the sanctuaries fell quiet. The river kept running. The people learned new prayers. Many of the old stones stayed where they stood and waited for other words. The language of Egypt survived by changing its clothes. The speech of field and market learned the Greek alphabet and added letters to catch native sounds, a script we call Coptic. In that dress, the old tongue walked into church and monastery and sang psalms with the cadence of the Nile. The months of the ancient civil calendar kept their order and were baptized into the cycle of the martyrs. Thout still began the year when the flood receded. The feast of a new year still smelt of ripe dates and cut reeds. In Upper Egypt, men and women went into the desert not to deny Egypt, but to perfect it. Antony sought silence among black hills and became a father to hermits. Pachomius founded houses by the river at Tabenesi, where monks prayed in choir and worked in fields and copied books under rules that read like measured offerings. Shanut at the White Monastery near Sohag preached with the vigor of an Old Kingdom quarrymaster. He scolded the rich, rebuked the careless, denounced idols, and defended the poor. His letters and sermons show a world where old temples stood within a day's walk of new churches, where villagers asked saints for rain and protection, and where monks railed at charms even as some Christian amulets borrowed the shapes and formulas of an older craft. In papyri written in Coptic, the names of the Trinity sit beside signs long loved, the loop of life sometimes reimagined as a cross that promises victory over death, the Ujjat eye simplified into a plea for health. The Book of the Dead slept, but new books of prayer promised that a good heart would be received in heaven. In homes and on riverbanks, the mother and child became a holy picture, and some artists gave Mary the gravity and tenderness that Isis had worn for centuries. Scholars advise caution, for similarity need not be dissent, yet the visual echo is hard to miss along the old roads. Another conquest taught endurance rather than despair. Arab armies came with swift horses and the certainty of a new revelation. In the years around 640, the generals of the Caliph took fortress towns and accepted treaties from bishops and headmen. At Fustat, near Memphis, the first mosque rose beside the river. The tax lists changed script, and in time, Arabic became the language of courts and markets, while Coptic held fast in liturgy and in village speech far longer than strangers expected. The saints of the new church kept guard over canals and threshing floors. The archangel Michael stood over the flood as a patron of the waters. Monasteries in the Wadi Natron kept libraries and welcomed travelers from many lands. The memory of the temples shifted into stories of vanished kings and into the authority of sacred places reused. At Luxor, a mosque took shelter within the courts of a pharaonic house, a living witness that worship never left the riverbank, only changed its address. In the countryside, people wore small crosses as their grandfathers had worn amulets. They wrote charms that pleaded with the God of Abraham to send scorpions away and to bless the first cry of a child. Islam brought its own scholarship and its own care for the law. Judges measured cases with texts familiar to the faithful. Chroniclers preserved tales of famine and flood, and of the lives of holy men and women. The Nile still rose and fell. The harvest still turned on canals and dikes that could be traced on maps from the reign of a pharaoh. The gods of Egypt had been asked to sleep, but the habits they taught had become second nature. People kept names and calendars, kept lights before images, kept the belief that justice is a balance and that words shape the world. The old faith did not die at once. It seeped into the foundation of a new house and gave it a floor that felt like the river's mud after the flood, firm and cool and ready for seed. The silence of the temples did not last forever. In the summer of the year 1799, soldiers digging near a ruined fort at Rashid lifted a dark slab whose surface shone with three kinds of writing. Priests at Memphis in the reign of Ptolemy had ordered a decree carved in the stately hand of hieroglyphs for the gods, in the swift curves of Demotic for the courts, and in Greek for the councils. The stone itself had fallen, had broken, had been reused and half buried, but the decree endured like a sealed letter waiting for eyes that could read it. In Alexandria and then in London, scholars puzzled over the parallel lines. Thomas Young tested cartouches that held royal names and guessed at sounds. Jean-François Champollion, who loved Coptic as a living heir of the old tongue, saw further. He announced in his letter to the Academy in the year 1822 that the signs of the temples could speak in more than one way. They could picture a thing, they could hint at its class with a final sign, and they could also carry sound. He read Ptolemy and Cleopatra, then Ramses and Thutmose, and at last a whole grammar stood where fancy had wandered. A script long thought to be pure symbol became a language again. The dead uttered names and dates and prayers, and those words placed the old religion back in its rooms. The century that followed was a pilgrimage of careful eyes and patient hands. Napoleon had carried scholars as well as soldiers to the Nile, and their description of Egypt, a mountain of plates and notes, fixed temples and towns on paper before they could vanish. Auguste Mariette walked the sands with the instincts of a hunter, found the buried streets of the Serapeum at Saqqara with its long corridors, lined with sarcophagi for sacred bulls, and founded a service to guard the monuments. Flinders Petrie came with measuring cords and notebooks and taught excavation to count every shard, to love potsherds as much as statues, to read layers of sand as a chronology in earth. At Thebes, James Burton copied the paintings of the kings. Then Champollion and Rosellini took drawings and squeezes, and later teams recorded every hour of the night that the royal tomb walls narrate. In the year 1922, Howard Carter knelt before a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and saw the glint of gold through a crack, a sight as bright as the dawn over Memphis. Inside lay a boy king on his bed of lion-footed wood and gold, wrapped in linen and nested in coffins and shrines, a funerary world kept with a care that confounded those who believed that desert always devours memory. Newspapers sold curses with ink as cheap as sand. The real marvel lay in the craft and in the words. The spells on a golden shrine consoled the dead with the old promise that Osiris rises and that the sun returns. The first time was not only recovered in palaces of the dead, the temples began to speak in voices no one had heard for 15 centuries. Edfu yielded its long inscriptions, a priestly encyclopedia where Horus fights the companions of Seth and where calendars of offerings march in orderly lines. Dendera gave silvered ceilings where the stars are drawn as gods, and where a goddess with the face of a woman and the ears of a cow presides over music and birth. Philae whispered to surveyors that the river had always been a liturgy. When the Aswan High Dam rose, and the floods that had fed the land since the dawn were tamed into a lake, the world gathered to repay a very old debt. Engineers cut Abu Simbel into blocks and moved the seated colossi of Ramesses above the new shoreline. The island of Philae was fled with its temples to a higher ground at Agilkia, so that Isis would not drown. The rescue became itself a festival of Ma'at, a demonstration that measure and will could save what time and water threatened. On stones across Egypt, epigraphers traced faint signs with light and paper, and photographers fixed colors before they paled. Scholars catalogued and translated and argued with a seriousness that the priestly schools of Heliopolis and Memphis would have recognized. A second life for Egyptian myth grew beyond scholarship. part truth, and part romance. In European capitals, obelisks were raised beside rivers, the one from Luxor in Paris and a pair called Cleopatra's Needles in London and New York, silent spines of the sun transplanted to colder skies. Museums filled with granite and gold, and with figures of Bes and Taweret, who look as friendly in glass cases as they did on bed legs in Thebes. Opera houses staged Ida with trumpets and moonlit courts, where choruses praised Ptah and Isis, as if grand music could rebuild Memphis for an evening. Secret societies and novelists borrowed gilded images and turned them into riddles and ordeals. The public read translations of the Book of the Dead that were sometimes more Victorian poetry than Egyptian prayer and loved them all the same. Meanwhile, philologists revised spell numbers and corrected readings. Coffin texts were edited, and Book of the Two Ways maps were traced from coffins in museums. The sober tide slowly drowned the fancy. Scholars showed how the flood rises because the sun draws the waters south and because equatorial rains fill the channels. And at the same time, they kept respect for the people who made the rising Nile into a promise of eternal return. The best guides spoke of Heka without sneer and confessed that a civilization can hold practical skill and metaphysical trust in a single hand. Modern Egypt claimed this inheritance with authority. The Antiquities Service created by Mariette became a national office. Egyptian scholars read the stones of their own ancestors and taught in their own universities. The museum in Cairo gathered a city of statues under a single roof and then planned a home even larger near the pyramids. Laws were written to keep ancient goods from leaving the valley except by loan and by treaty. When tourists came by the thousand, guides mixed story and fact in a cadence the Nile understands. Coptic churches in Cairo and in the countryside kept the old language as prayer and recited the months by names that the builders of Saqqara would have known. In mosques that shelter within pharaonic courts, the call to prayer rises beside columns that once watched ram-headed Amun pass in procession. The ancient theology returned not as cult, but as memory made plain. A modern farmer still speaks of the balance of things when he weighs grain. A judge still cares for the straightness of a measure. An engineer who watches the river gauges in summer shows the same worry a priest once felt before the nilometer. The old religion survives in habits of mind, in art and proverb, in the reverence that people feel for stones on which time is visible. The myths themselves remain more than curiosities. The Ennead of Heliopolis, the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, the Memphite doctrine of Ptah, the rise of Amun in Thebes, the journeys of Ra by day and by night, the passion of Osiris, and the triumph of Horus, the feather of Ma'at, and the heart that must weigh against it. These are not only lines in a book, they are metaphors that still work. They teach that creation is an act renewed every morning, that names secure a place in the world, that justice is a balance and not a shout, that mourning can lead to mending, that order and storm must find a settlement. When visitors stand at dawn on the Giza Plateau and see the sun line the edge of the stones with fire, they feel what the first builders felt. When a child in a museum presses her face to the glass to look at a blue faience amulet in the shape of an eye, she is looking at protection made visible. When a scholar reads a spell that a scribe copied onto a sarcophagus board 4,000 years ago and understands every word, the world shrinks and deepens at the same time. The river has not ceased to teach. Egypt did not disappear. Its gods found new names. Its old tongue lived on in Coptic prayer, and the calendar kept time with the flood. A broken stone at Rashid let scholars hear the temples again, and the stories rose from silence with their dates and voices intact. Modern engineers lifted Abu Simbel and set Philae on higher ground, a careful rescue that honored measure and memory. Today the statues stand, the texts can be read, and the river still shines at dawn. That is enough to know that the first morning is never far away.